Hey, welcome. My name is Zach Ayer, and I'm the Education Manager for United World Wrestling. And first, I'd just like to thank everybody for being on today's Risk Management for Coaches webinar. I think today is really it's an important topic, and I think it's great for any level of coach as well, from either just beginning your coaching career or somebody who's been coaching for a number of years. And I think this topic is even really great for those of you that are just leaders in sport. I know, for example, just in addition to my coaching experience, I've, worked as a director of sport at a school for 3 years. And then during that time, we had 20 sports at that school with over 400 athletes and over 50 coaches. And I know that risk management was a topic that we routinely covered and talked about, in every one of those areas. So even if you're a leader of a club or, an owner club, I think this is such a great topic for just to review and cover, because there's always some great things to learn in that process. So again, I appreciate everybody being here today. And to get started, the first thing, as always, I kind of like to just do a quick poll to find out where everybody is checking in from. And certainly that I know that there will be probably some more people add on as the webinar progresses. So this just kind of gives me a quick, indication of where everybody's kind of checking in from. And then as soon as I'll give everybody about 30 seconds to select an answer here, and then I'll share the results with everybody as well. Certainly it's always great to see where everybody is, connecting in from, as we're doing these webinars. Just, wrestling is such a global, a global, sport, and it's such, we're looking at, such diversity across the world. I don't know if there's another sport that doesn't represent from around, so many different areas. So again, thank you to all of you that are on here. So, those of you checking in from Asia, so Alsania, you guys led the way right now. So, I think the next part is I kind of progress, into this. This is such an important topic. And I think as coaches, there are so many different topics and different jobs and responsibilities that coaches have and when doing the job. And so I actually have a second poll question here. And I really just want to kind of find out where everybody's at on this. Of all the jobs that coaches have to do, what would you deem as the most important role or job as the coach? So I'm going to run another poll and see what the results are for this. So you should have a second question up here that allows you to select one of these choices. So I'll give you a few minutes, a minute or so here to select the one that you think is the most important job of the coach. The first one is teaching wrestling technique, and then the second one is winning matches. The third choice is the safety of the wrestlers. The fourth one is planning training sessions. The fifth one is teaching tactics to win, like strategies in wrestling to win. And then communication with stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, that's the wrestlers, the parents, other coaches, the referees, anybody involved in the sport. Is that part. So that's what those are. And then if one of those is not what you think the most important job is, please select the other one as well. So, I'll give you about another, 15 seconds here to cast a vote. So even if you would vote, that would be great. I love the participation, just to see kind of where we're at in this process. All right, I'm going to share the results here. So the results we have here, so that the majority of you really kind of selected a couple of things, which is the safety of the wrestler and then planning training sessions. I think when I look at this list, I think that literally every one of these things is an important part of the job as a coach. I think you have to be able to teach technique. I think You want to focus on, the winning of matches. How can you win matches, which gets into the teaching of tactics to win, planning training sessions. Last webinar that I was on was on communication and how we can improve communication. But certainly I think that when we look at this, that the safety of the wrestlers, in my opinion, is the single most important job of a coach. I think that when we, right now there's like a sort of a global movement, and really, headed up by the IOC, and just a lot of things have happened over the course of the last few years in terms of athlete safeguarding. And I think as coaches, we really, and really a leader in the sport, your main job is to ensure athlete safety. And I think that as we go through this part of the webinar, those are things that we're going to really have in the forefront of our mind. And I'd imagine that some of the things that we cover today are going to be things that you probably normally do. But just having that thought process and having that always, as one of your main focus points is such an important part of that, because I know that one of the things that we have to do is make sure we provide a safe environment for our athletes to train, compete, and be a part of, and really make sure that this is a safe sport. When I think about great coaches, this quote is one thing that seems to come up for me, when I look at it. Great coaches are great humanitarians. They really care for the athletes as people first and athletes second. And I probably ask you to go back and actually just think for a second, what, do you remember, you probably know of a coach that really only cared about results. It only mattered if the athlete won the match, or really any competition for that matter. Are those considered great coaches? And I think when we start looking at it, I think now as coaches, it's more about making sure we're doing what's best for the athlete and keeping that athlete's safety and health and well-being in mind at all times. There's a great coach that coached American football in the United States. His name was Lou Holtz, and he coached at the University of Notre Dame, which is actually not too far away from where I'm at. And he said that, on his team, he said that the athletes, those that follow you, are going to ask 3 questions. The first question is, can I trust you? The athlete has to know that they can trust you. And I think trust is something that gets established over time through a variety of actions, but certainly a very valid question. The second question they're going to ask you is, are you committed to excellence? Are you committed to doing the best that you can do at all times? Are you committed to doing what's best for them at all times? I think that's, again, just a great question as well. And he said the third question they're going to ask you is, do you care about me? And I think when we look at this quote, I think that really kind of is hitting that nail on the head here, as that it's so important that as a coach, one of our first responsibilities is to care for our athletes and to make sure their safety and well-being is in the forefront of our minds at all time. And with Lou Holtz, he said, the great coaches and the great leaders, their followers and their athletes will be able to answer yes to all 3 of those questions. So I would encourage you to look at your situation and those questions for you, and can they answer yes? And if they can't, make sure you work on those. Today, what we're going to focus on is the next part here, which is going to be on that safety part. And so here are the things that we really want to cover and be able to answer today. So I have our objectives up here on the screen, and they're all in the form of a question. So my goal is at the end of the webinar, we'll be able to answer each of these questions. The first one, what is risk management, and what is the coach's role within risk management? When we're assessing risk, what are some things the coach should consider before, during, and after a training session? So we'll kind of get some things, or some questions and some thoughts to think about as you go through that. What are the 3 risk management steps? And then how do we use the risk reduction matrix when we're doing this process of risk management or following those steps? Where does that come into play, and how do we use that to make decisions going forward? So, as we go through this, I think the one thing to really keep in mind is, I'll try to provide some examples from my own experience, But many times you're going to have to think about this with your current situation. What are your current training areas, your athletes, all of your things? How does that work for you? And then apply some of these, these techniques and topics to your own situation. The first question here is, what is risk management? And so there's a quote here, came out of an article here that says risk management is the process of decision making and implementation so as to minimize injuries and loss and their effects on your sport, organization, facility, and event. Now, I think there's a lot of great things in there, and I want to kind of break that down into just some smaller parts. The first part here is focusing on that middle part. The goal of risk management is to help minimize injuries, and really making sure that this, minimizes that impact and the loss between the sport, your organization, your facility, your event, the athletes, etc. That's an important part of risk management, is minimizing that part. The second part is the beginning part of this, which says the process of decision making. Because risk management, I think when we really sum it up, maybe the best way to look at this is it's identifying sensible measures to control the risk in your training environment. Is there things that we can do and we can take advantage of in the process of going through that is risk management. This is not designed to give you more work to do, but really just to change a little bit about how you think and how you approach things. Because many times these risk management steps in this process we're going through happens on a day-to-day basis, whether we know that or not, And so what we're going to do is kind of put this down of what this looks like and just get that thought process more out in front of us. The next part here is, what is the coach's role in risk management? And I think, as I covered earlier, and majority of you saw with your results from the poll, was that the main responsibility we have as a coach is safety. Like, we need to make sure we're providing a safe environment for the athletes to train, to compete. And really, safety is not just what happens there, but it's really the entire spectrum. From how we interact with those athletes, how we build them up, how we teach them the lifelong skills. All those things I think are such an important part of this process. But safety is our main responsibility. If we're coaching, we want our athletes to be safe at the end of this. And I think the other part that comes into this is, how can we minimize risk when we see it? And I think that's another key attribute of a coach, is being able to see situations and then be able to find ways to take steps to minimize the risk and the impact it could have on those athletes. So that's one of the things that we're looking at, which leads to another question here, which is, when should risk be assessed? When do we assess risk in situations? When do we sit down, or when do we take a look at this? And I think the one thing we're going to see here is really, it's all the time. It happens before the session even starts. It happens during the session. While you're actively coaching, you should be assessing risk during that time all the time. And then after the session gets done, there are some steps and some things that you can do to assess the risk and help minimize it in certain ways. So what we're going to do now is kind of go through each of these parts, like what should we think about before the session? What should we think about during the session? And what should we think about after the session? And then we'll kind of pull that into what the risk management steps are, and then how we use that risk reduction matrix to help make decisions and maybe make changes going forward. So the first thing we have here is, we want to look at is before the session. And I have these listed up here as questions, again, because I don't know everybody's situation, but I think that these are good questions for you just to consider before you even get started having a wrestling training session. The first thing is, there any unused equipment that's out? I think this is really, that's twofold. I think anytime you have equipment that's just out and laying around, two things can happen. One, kids and athletes can be injured because maybe they try to do something they shouldn't do with it, or they trip on it, whatever that is. But it's also, when things are out, they become damaged. So as a coach, from a standpoint, I certainly want to keep the things that we have really nice. So keeping those things stored, one is going to prevent injuries, but also allow it to last longer. So it's kind of twofold. The second one is the fire escape, signs, plans in place for emergencies. One thing I'd ask you is how many of you have an emergency action plan for your club, or where you train? And if you don't have one, I would certainly encourage you to get one. I know that when I started as a director of sport at the school I was at the time, one of the focus points I had was by the end of that year, I was going to have emergency action plans for every venue that we had and for each of the sports and the events that we were hosting, because, one, we want to make sure, all of the stakeholders, the wrestlers, the coaches, the fans, the referees, everybody is safe if an emergency happens. And I think having a plan in place allows that to happen. And also, from being somebody in the United States, where I'm coming from, liability is also an important issue that coaches have to be mindful of. And if there's something that's done negligently that an athlete becomes injured, we're going to be responsible for that. And so, not only do I not want the athlete to get hurt, but then I also don't want, there's a liability factor that comes into play with coaches as well. So I think having those emergency action plans are certainly very important to have. The next one is, are there sharp objects? Simply walking around the practice area, wherever you're practicing at, and looking for anything that might be sharp or dangerous that the kids could step on, they could land on, that would cause an injury. And if you're, maybe you're outside training, some of you are checking in, maybe at beach wrestling and you're out on the sand, making sure that you walk around that area and looking for things that could be sharp. Those could be shells for that matter. But I think that's just an important part to look, again, to reduce our injury. The next one is space for number of participants. I think it's extremely important for coaches to know, how many participants are they going to have in that training session? And how does that work with the space that you have for practice? I think sometimes you have to make some decisions on what you're going to do, and those things can be done ahead of time if you know how much space is going to be needed for this. For example, I know that if we're doing double legs, I'm going to need some space for them to finish because they're going to be running their feet and it's going to take more space. So I have to adjust practice accordingly, and I can do that beforehand. Next one, the wrestling mat, or really the practice surface that you're on, is it correct and safe? This picture is certainly a great practice room. Listed here, and these mats are Velcroed together so that I know those mats are put together correctly. But if you don't have a mat that Velcros together, and maybe you have to, you have sections and you have to tape them down, are they together? Are there gaps in between them? For those of you that have the tarp down that goes over top of it, making sure that the pieces all fit together so there's not places where they could step and turn an ankle. Those are all important processes that you want to take care of before the session starts. Another important aspect is the coach to participant ratio. How many coaches do you have at the training session versus the number of athletes that you have? Certainly having 50 participants with one coach is not a good number. And I think that really hurts your ability to be able to supervise correctly and being able to see those things. And I know as a coach myself, like in the coaching staff that I have, I try to get as many coaches as we have that can be at practice every day, because that allows us to have more people in the room, which allows them to have more one-on-one interaction with the athletes, which ultimately is going to, one, help keep them safe, and two, help them improve. So I think increasing that number, making sure you have a good ratio, is important. And the last really question here before the session to consider is the safety concerns with technique and training. Are you doing some things and some activities that could be, could have risk associated with it? And I think that as you go through that planning process, you want to start to identify those things and maybe put that into your practice plan to make sure you illustrate, hey, be careful with this, make sure that you keep your head up during this drill. And I think those are just things you consider. And I will tell you, like, one of probably a future webinars we're going to get into is how do you design practice plans? And there's a lot of different topics that go into that. And one of those is a risk management in that training. And those are things that you include in that training plan. So these are just some things to think about, that occur before the session. The next part now is looking at assessing risk while practice is going on. Because once practice started, that doesn't mean we can stop thinking about, dangerous situations, if even more, we need to be more alert of the situations when they happen, because they will happen very quickly and we have to be able to take action quickly. The first one is looking at the spacing of the wrestlers. For those of you that have been in practices, you know that they have a tendency to often get, they start working closer together in situations. And sometimes, you may, as a coach, may see that and they have to be able to step in between groups. That way that if they land on you and not on the athletes behind them. So I think it's always important to make sure you're taking a look at the spacing and where they're at and constantly making sure that they're at a good space for the practice or for that drill. As I mentioned, if we're doing double legs, we know we need to have space for them to be able to land and not land on somebody else. Another part is looking for incorrect technique and something that can cause injuries. And you certainly see this with, newer wrestlers. I'm not going to say younger, but just new to the sport. They get out there, they're trying things, and they're not used to maybe doing the techniques. You have to be very careful to make sure that they don't do something incorrectly that may cause injury to themselves or to others. So certainly as coaches, you're moving around and you're looking, it's important to look for those things. The next one is, wrestlers matched on size, developmental stage, and ability. Such an important aspect of that too. You don't want to partner a wrestler who's been wrestling for 13 years with one who just started for their first time. That's probably not going to go well, particularly if it's in sort of a live situation. So making sure you pair those up accordingly so that way, there's not going to be the potential for injury because somebody picks somebody up that shouldn't have and then, and they land really hard. We want to avoid that. And I think that just goes into how you match them up and making sure that they get matched up correctly. The last one here is also making sure you're looking for possible injuries that occur and also being mindful of heat-related illnesses. If you have the opportunity and you have a training facility that has an environment, it's controlled, the environment's controlled, like you can control the temperature in the room, that's outstanding to have. But I'm guessing that not everybody has that opportunity. And sometimes you're just kind of at the mercy of whatever the temperature is outside, that whether that's hot or whether that's cold. But I know that, with wrestling, it's such an active sport and you're going that when the temperature is either hot and it's humid, the chances of getting heat-related illnesses are very common. And you have to be looking for those things. And I can go into more detail with that, potentially at some other time. But, I know that I have to do, every 2 years here where I coach, I have to do required training on heat illness prevention. So it's such an important topic and we don't want, athletes to become dehydrated, have heat exhaustion or heat stroke because of, the conditions and they were pushing themselves too hard. We have to see that and then be able to dial them back in that process. Now, after the session gets done, there's some things to start to consider as well. First is checking with the athletes. I always like after every session to just kind of like touch base with every one of the athletes who are there just to make sure that they're okay, see how practice was. And sometimes you just have to build them up if they didn't have maybe practice didn't go well. I know for myself, we require every athlete to shake the hands of the coaches before they leave. And that just allows us to check on them. Hey, are you okay? Is your elbow fine? And just get that dialogue with them if they need to go see a trainer or something like that afterwards. So take time to do that. Certainly the next one is big now, disinfecting the mats. And this was important before COVID-19, and it's even more important now is making sure that we're cleaning the surfaces that those athletes are on. Wrestling is a contact sport, and so you're going to be in close contact with athletes all the time, and they're going to be in contact with a mat. And I think that it's important that those surfaces be disinfected between practices and before the start of each practice. Because certainly in addition to the COVID-19, there's a number of skin infections that can occur if mats aren't disinfected correctly that can prevent athletes from participating. And so I think it's important that gets monitored, from your end as a coach. And then four, just certainly checking the potential for hazards. Is there anything that's still left out? Is there, and really number three, the equipment properly stored. I think those two, kind of work together. You're walking around at the end of practice and making sure things get picked up And is there anything that's potentially out there that could be dangerous for the start of the next practice, and making sure you take care of it then. The last one here, I think, is such an important part of reflecting on practice. Many times we get done with a practice, and then do we sit down afterwards and just maybe make notes, have a thought process, and say, okay, what worked well, what didn't work well, what were some areas that, gosh, this didn't work very well, they were falling into each other, some kids were getting hurt. How can we really do a better job with this? And I think taking that opportunity to reflect is going to help you going forward. I heard a quote the other day, or actually just saw a quote yesterday, that says, you don't learn from experience, you learn from reflecting on your experience. And I think that's a critical part of in coaching, is making sure you reflect back on it, because that's how we really learn. Now, as we transition, I want to get into, the 3 risk management steps. And really what we've been doing over the last 10 to 15 minutes here is looking at risk identification. In the risk management step process, step number 1 is just being able to identify it. And I think the more you think about it, the more you're going to see about it. I know that when I was the director of sport for that time, I started finding things that my thought process completely changed, because I was looking for those risk areas that I had to be more aware of that I wasn't before when I was just coaching. So step 1 is identifying risk. The second step then is risk reduction. And we're going to get into this a little bit more detail on the next slide, in terms of how do we identify risk, how do we assess it, and then what are the different options we have. And certainly as a coach, one of those things that we want to be able to do, if possible at all times, is reduce the risk associated with it. So if we can reduce the risk, and then our third step in this process is risk planning and monitoring. So I think, how we, plan going forward, how we monitor what's already happened, and keeping tabs on those areas that have potential for risk and injuries, I think is an important step, to keeping record of those things and being able to review those as we plan practices, as we look. Maybe something is damaged and we need to get it fixed. Well, we document it so it's something we don't forget about in that process. And the last slide I want to get to here before I take some questions is, and I think this is such an important slide. It kind of pulls everything together in terms of what we've talked about, and then how do you apply it going forward. The first step we mentioned is identifying the risk level. And so now, once we've identified that risk level, now we really need to assess the risk. What is the risk that we have, and how much, what's the potential problem that could come from this? And when we look at that, so we have our risk level. Is it low? Is it high? Or, somewhere in between? The next thing we have to look at with this is the cost of risk reduction. Now, when people hear the word cost, they often think of money. And certainly, I think there could be a financial component in here, but it's not so much that. When I think of cost, it's what you would have to give up to reduce it or to eliminate it. What are you going to have to change, or what's going to have to be different in order for that risk to be minimized? So you have to look at the two things. 1, where's the risk level at? And then 2, what's the cost of that risk for risk reduction? To reduce it, what is that going to cost? And now you do this, and now this allows you to figure out, like, which block do you fall in? Is it low risk and a low cost to reduce it? Perfect. That's low risk. Let's definitely move forward with that. But you have to look at where it falls. Is it fall in the manageable risk part, or does it fall in the not acceptable risk? And every situation you look at, you have to apply that process, where it's at. Now, once you've figured out where it falls on this grid, the next step is you have one of 3 choices you can do going forward. You either have risk avoidance, which means you completely it's not worth it. We're not even going to do that. For example, I'll give you an example. Here's a quick example of this. There was a game that we used to always play, and I played growing up. It was called mat ball. And we had 2 squares taped on both ends of the wrestling mat. And then the participants, we had to be on our knees, and we had a ball. And the object was you to stay on your knees, but you had to get the ball in the square with 2 hands. And if you did, you got a point, and then you started over. And that was really all the rules were. So really, there was a lot of wrestling that happened during that time. You just had to stay on your knees, and kids are wrestling each other, trying to get the ball and different things. But what started to happen is periodically over time, what I noticed is the number of injuries that always came from that activity really escalated. And it got to the point to now, like the risk level, to me, in that opinion, that game is so high, and there's really not a way to reduce the risk and still have that game. So we just avoid it altogether. Like, I will never do that activity again because, in my opinion, the risk level is too high because of injuries that are going to come from that. For another example, for some of you who may be training outside, a storm comes through, there's lightning. In my opinion, that's unacceptable risk. Like that, there's nothing you can do to reduce it other than go inside. And if you can go inside, great, you continue to keep training. But if your only training facility is outdoors, it's best to just avoid the risk because, what could happen from it is so catastrophic that we don't want that to put our athletes in that harm's way. So I think some things you have to look at, and the first thing you can look at is if the risk is too great and the cost to reduce it is great, then you know what? It's best just to avoid it. The next thing you can do is risk acceptance. Certainly there's some things that you have that are going to have a risk to it, and maybe you can and can't reduce it. Like, it's just there. And then you have to look to see where that's at. If it's manageable, then you just accept the risk that's associated with it and you move forward. I think to some extent, wrestling in itself you have to have some sort of risk assessment or acceptance just to do the sport, because it's a combat sport, it's dynamic, and certainly there's a chance for injury that could happen at any time. Even if everything is done correctly, there's certainly a chance that somebody could get hurt in the process. So I think in some aspect, you're always taking a risk acceptance into some areas. But I think that's what you have to look at as a coach is this acceptable risk, that they could get, an injury may occur from this, but to me, the risk is low, and we're just going to accept it and move forward. The third thing here is risk reduction, which is that second step we talked about in that risk management steps, is reducing risk. And I think there's a lot of ways to reduce risk, but I think it's very dependent upon your situation and what resources you have to reduce it. I'll give you an example. I mentioned earlier about having blast doubles and space to be able to do that. So we had a drill that kind of came up with, I'm big about just creating something that works for what I need a drill that just needs to happen, to duplicate a look. So we had a drill where the wrestlers would kind of have a scramble. They would come out of a scramble, and then right when they came out of it, we wanted to fire a blast double against their opponent, because sometimes the best time to score is right after that, because there's always a lull in the action. So we had a drill where they would start just sitting down, and they would have to hip heist, flip their hips, and as soon as they did, then they would, go directly into a blast double. Well, if I did this drill out in the middle, just with everybody going whatever direction, it is inevitable that people are going to land on each other, heads are going to hit, arms are going to get landed on, somebody's probably going to get hurt. So one of the ways I still wanted to do the drill, so one of the ways to implement this to reduce the risk was to put everybody down at one end of the room. And then we would have like 5 to 6 groups across, and we would have one group go. So they would hip heist, then they would do their blast double, they would finish it, and then they would get set up, they would do it again, and they would move down the room. And after they did 2 blasts, that first group got 2 blast doubles, I would start the next group. So I wasn't having everybody go at the same time. I was having them go periodically. That way we had enough space for them to land. That way nobody was getting injured. I still got the look that I wanted to out of the drill. And that the part that it just took longer to do. So my cost of the risk reduction to me was low because all I did is I just had to plan better for time, because I knew it would take longer to get through this than just letting every wrestling group, do their own at their own time. So we just structured it a little bit better, but that reduced the risk to help reduce the injury. So that's just an example of something you could do that involve just plan that before practice, or if you see something happening in practice, immediately you switch and move into something that's going to be safer, that's going to reduce risk. So I think that's a little bit about how you kind of pull everything together, from identifying risk, you assess it, looking at that cost reduction, and then you have to just basically place it. Where does it go? Am I going to avoid this altogether? Am I going to accept it and just go with what it is? Or is there a way I can reduce it? And certainly if there's a way you can reduce it, you always want to take that stance. Now, at the bottom of your screen, I'd like to take time just to go through any questions that you may have. And certainly at your screen, there should be a Q&A button. So if you have any questions, please, feel free to put those questions at the bottom, and I'll go through and answer as many as I can during this time. And then after, 10 to 15 minutes here, I'll kind of recap a little bit of everything, and then we'll end the webinar. So if you have any questions, please, type those, at the bottom. I would certainly appreciate it. And if you have questions about something that I've done or how did I handle this situation, I'm certainly always welcome to help, and give you, at least what I've done on my end. And I certainly know that everybody's situation is a little different here. It's also great. I saw we increased up to over 50 participants. So, and picked up another 15 over the course of the webinar. So it was great. Yeah, I don't see any questions, and that's great if there's no questions. And certainly if you think of something that comes up later, feel free to email me. I know most of you probably, you got the link. So at the bottom where all the links were for the webinars for the week is my email address with United World Wrestling. And if you reach out to me, I'll certainly, be glad to help any way that I can, or at least, give you an opinion in terms of going forward. So there was a question that came up here, so I'll go through and answer it here. It says, what do you do when there's a size disparity between participants, but you cannot change the situation? So you have somebody who is a, rather, large and much bigger wrestler than the one that's there. I think one thing you can do is you can certainly still, practice and you can still have activities, but you have to be very mindful of what things you can't do. For example, I would certainly not have live wrestling situations with those two individuals because it's going to be very difficult for them to be able to compete against each other. I think also you can do some drilling, but even with the one who maybe is much larger and maybe much stronger, you have to really be careful and be there to spot them, that they don't accidentally hurt them because they're so much stronger. So I think you can still do things, but I think you have to try to limit how the intensity of the workout with them. And I certainly think anytime you can structure things that operate with, you can structure things where they can be done individually, that's great. I know that certainly one area that we do sometimes, because sometimes we have our young kids at our club will come in, and there's a couple of kids that are really big, but they don't have anybody in their size. Maybe we'll have somebody that's older that fits in their size bracket, practice with them, but we'll have that conversation with that, like, hey, if you're there to help them, so it's for their benefit, and that really helps reduce their level of intensity during that time and allows that other wrestler to have an opportunity to work with somebody their size. So, certainly that's a problem, especially if you don't have large numbers. So great question. Next question here. What do you think about risk assessment about coming competition such as, weather? I'm not quite sure what the question in terms of what you're looking for, in terms of, when I'm assessing with the weather, if our situation is indoors, here's what I'll tell you. If it's indoors and it's just a storm, I'm not worried about that. What I would be concerned about certainly is if there was like a tornado or there was some extreme weather event that was happening. then I would certainly take precautions and get athletes into a safe location. And I've been a part of that where we've had some, weather situations that have came up and we've had to cancel practice or cancel a competition or move the competition back because of weather. For us, we get a little bit of everything, and our main time of wrestling in our schools is in the winter, which we have snow and ice, and there's times where we came in and literally, all right, practice is done, you're going home, because we've got to get home because the weather and the roads are starting to get bad. So I think you have to really, kind of evaluate on a situation by situation basis with that. And I think you have to look at what your weather is and what your standard of operating procedures are for that. And again, that's probably a question to have with your coaches, with your club, again, looking at what that emergency action plan looks like. Environmental difference from travel planning risk. I think, when you're looking, I think, certainly with the time we're in here with COVID-19, I think there's just going to be there's a lot of unknown right now in terms of traveling and what that traveling is going to look like. And I think you're just going to be at the, kind of following the guidelines of the place that you're going. Certainly, here where I'm at, every state is operating on certainly some different guidelines. And even within our state for a time, we had certain areas that were operating under different procedures. So I think you have to take into account what those procedures and when you're decide if you want to travel and go to those competitions or not. Next one, when using the technique, risk technique may injure to wrestler, then what precaution can we take? I think that you have to look at each technique and like what those injuries may occur. And then you have to look at, and this just becomes a thought process. Like, how can you, if it's a technique that you think is still extremely valid, that you really want them to know, then you have to have a, way to make that safe for how they're going to do that. It's, when we're doing something, with wrestling, you may, and I think one thing that I think is important, if you're going to put this in, is you make sure you identify those areas of concern in your practice plan, and you tell that to your athletes. Like, hey, during this time, like we're doing a leg attack, and as we're circling here, make sure we don't bring that leg back so that the leg doesn't go against the joint of the knee. And I think if you structure that in your practice, you won't forget to tell them. And then then that's going to be in their mind, and they're going to know, hey, I got to make sure that I don't do this because this is a place that somebody could get injured. Because certainly you want to make sure you're minimizing that practice. I think the best way to make sure you do that with techniques that sometimes can be potentially risky is to make sure you indicate those safety within your practice plan and then communicate that to your wrestlers. Next one, performing your risk assessment plan. Do you adjust your plan during the season? I think that you do. I think there's a whole aspect of this, and this is in a course that we're developing right now for the web for our online platform, and I'm certain that it'll turn into a webinar. But when we're looking at practice planning, I think you do have to have a reasonable progression. You can't come in and ask everybody to start performing at this really high level when they haven't done the steps to lead up to it. So I think when you're looking at your risk assessment, I think you first start by developing an overall plan of how you want to implement your techniques and your procedures and your process as you go through. I know that when we get into this process, there's another term that comes in, which is periodization, which is, how your training changes over time to be able to reach your best ability. And that is much of that structuring of the live. Like, we'll come in, we may do a little live wrestling at the beginning, but maybe not as much. Maybe with young kids, we'll have them start on their knees, to eliminate that falling down until we have that opportunity to teach them how to properly. So I think certainly I would agree here that you want to adjust your practices in such that you're lowering those risks and you're building up to more complex and more live situations in that. what's the best age for a kid to start wrestling training in regards of his safety? Yeah, it's a great question, Sharif. Um, I think that, it's hard to gauge, everywhere. I think the important part isn't so much when they start doing physical activity, like in a wrestling setting in a club. I know we've got athletes that start at the age of 5, but I think what's important for those first 3 to 4 years, from that 5 to 8 years old, is to make sure that the focus is really just on having fun. It doesn't have to even be great, focusing on so much technique. It's more of just about movements, learning how to roll, learning how to fall, just involving games and gamification in this process is such an important part of that. And then as they begin to develop, then you can start transitioning into those more, detailed parts. I think it just depends on what level they are coming in to start with. But if you're starting at again, your first between 5 and 8 years old, I would just make this more strictly on fun and safety, and implementing some techniques along the way, but not getting into, tons of competitions and things like that. You just are really introducing them to the sport, and we want them to stay around. So I would certainly encourage everybody to also attend the next webinar we have in a couple weeks. On this day, I'll be back, and we'll be looking at the role of coaches in youth sports. So we're going to take a look at some topics that are in there, like why kids participate, why do kids get out of participating, just so that we know and we can better adjust our practices to that. Next question, and I'm going to take a couple more here before we kind of wrap up everything. But this question: how do you address those developing countries who aren't able to access accidental insurance plans for their athletes? That's, I don't know that I have an answer for that, because certainly every country and developing countries have, their own situations. And I think that's where, as a coach, you have such an incredible job, to be able, how you plan, how you run practices, where your practices are at, how you upkeep the facility, so that you can help reduce accidents that may occur. And if you can do the very best you can, that's all that really can be asked. Because if they don't have the opportunity for an insurance plan, there's certainly, that's a risk that they have to outweigh. But if coaches are doing a great job and having that risk in the forefront, that just being able to think through that process, I think that that's the best way to address those situations. Which is the coach-athlete ratio you recommend working with youth? I think it probably really just depends on what article you look at. I think that when you're looking at just good ratios in general, somewhere between 8 to 10 to 1 is something that I really like to work with. And anytime we can keep those, and sometimes we break our groups up into, we'll have 4 coaches in there, we'll have 40 kids, we'll break them up into 10 and 5 in groups of 5. And then if we can add in more, that allows them, more interaction with it. But certainly the more coaches you can get, the better. But, if you can keep it 8 to 10, I think is great. But certainly I think there's other, information out there that's going to say, hey, here's the best number that we see. I know for our course-wise, when we do our education courses for the development department, we really like, from a coach to educator ratio of 15 to 1. Now that's a little bit different because we're not necessarily doing, wrestling practices. But I think if you can keep that into that 8 to 10 to 1, that's excellent. And even if it's even better than that, great. Next one: how would you handle live wrestling situations without having the help of a physician nearby in the club? I think one goes back to making sure that you pair up your athletes accordingly. There's sometimes such a wide range of ability. I know in my practice room, I have wrestlers who literally have just started wrestling for the first time, and I have wrestlers who wrestle across the nation, have been wrestling for 13 years. There's no chance I can put those two together and expect that to go well. So inevitably the one is going to get hurt. And I think you have to look as well too, like sometimes maybe you have a wrestler who's just not physically developed, and maybe he's not ready for live situations, wrestling situations yet. So maybe you pull them aside and just allow them to kind of watch and be a spectator, or give them something else to do. Maybe they're in a shadow drill during that time, but that's just a great way to handle some of those, because you certainly want to look to minimize injuries. And the best way to do that is making sure that you pair them up accordingly. And I think another part too, as a coach, as you're moving around, if you see a situation that gets risky, immediately stop it and then either get them back up to their feet, or separate them. And if tensions get high, you separate them into different people. But I think it's an important process. And again, that just falls back on the coach and how in tune they are to what's happening in the room. But trying to avoid live wrestling situations is certainly going to be difficult with the sport, especially if you're training and preparing for competition. So you have to look again for ways to just minimize it. Last two questions here I'll get to. As a coach, what should I focus on? Easy, most used positions, or low percentage positions? I think if you're talking about from a training aspect, I think it really just depends on what you believe. If you're focusing on, one aspect of it, I know one of our focuses, from different parts, we are going to focus on defending first, because I think that's easier. It's easy to do and easy for kids to learn quickly. And if it's hard to get scored on, it definitely puts them in a position to be successful. I think, when you're starting out early, I think it's important, especially if you're looking at youth, that you start off with just teaching them movements, like how to fall, like how to land, how to roll, because sometimes where you see injuries occur is just because of kids they don't know, they're not controlled their bodies fully yet. So we want to coach that aspect as well. So I think, if you're looking for some areas, and again, that's kind of a broad question, because if we're looking at really wrestling specific, that's a whole nother area. If we're looking from a risk management standpoint, I think an easy one certainly to do here is just focus on the movements, being able to do those things. There's 7 basic skills of wrestling, and I would focus on teaching those 7 basic skills first, and then integrate those into other positions as well. Last question here. Should we encourage athletes to do other sports such as football, soccer, boxing, other combat sports? This can increase the risk of injuries, which would impact wrestling training. I'm certainly a proponent of multiple sport athletes for 2 reasons. Number one, I think a large majority of our athletes are not going to reach the Olympic level. They're in a sport for more than just to become super successful in this process. Like, oh, I'm going to go be an Olympic champion. Certainly, we hope that they have that goal, but the reality is such a small percentage of athletes ever reach that level. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop them to be, I like to call it as building life champions. Like, our role as a coach is to build life champions. And if we're looking at, ways to actually minimize injury, when you specialize in one sport, you have a tendency to only work certain muscle groups. When you get involved in other sports, you actually develop those other muscle groups, which actually helps you to minimize injuries in the process. So there's definitely some studies that have been done that say that multiple sport athletes have less injuries than those that specialize in those. And I actually have a picture that I have on another presentation that I can't bring up real quickly here, but it says just that. So I would certainly encourage them. Athletes, they're young once. They only get one opportunity to participate in sports. Why not encourage them to get involved in other things? And maybe they find their passion, wasn't wrestling, maybe it was something else. Then you know what, as a coach, you help them. You helped guide them to what their passion was for that. So I don't think that we should discourage that process. And certainly I don't think I think anything they do can increase the risk of injuries. They could just be outside playing with friends. That could increase the risk of injuries. We're not going to eliminate that. So I don't think you would want to eliminate them, encourage them to do other sports in that process. I think that's a decision that they should make and not something that we should encourage as coaches. All right, great. Certainly some great questions here. Last thing I want to do here, kind of, share my screen again here and just recap the end here, and then I'll wrap it up. So just a quick review. I think that, and I've touched on these multiple times here, is that the coach's number one job is the safety of the athletes. If you can keep that in the forefront of your mind at all times, and even for those of you that may be leaders in your sport or in your club or in your federation, that should be just something that constantly is a thought process that you're always seeing. It's not something you have to do separate. It's just integrated into every aspect of your position. I think risks should be assessed at all times. Like there can really never be a time when we're not really looking at ways in which things could be, you know, where we could reduce the risk if it's possible, and know that we can take those steps to do that to keep our athletes safe. Again, such an important job is to make sure that athletes have a safe sport to participate in. I think that once risk is identified, you have to look at what's the cost of the risk. You have to determine that, and then you integrate that into your risk reduction matrix, and then make one of those three choices. Do you accept the risk and move forward knowing that that's a situation? Is there a way to minimize it? Let's reduce it. And I think anytime we can do that, that's certainly something you should do as a coach. And then lastly, I think if you run into a situation where this is just too great, then I think you want to avoid it altogether. So those are just some kind of final thoughts as we go through this. Again, I would just like to thank everybody for being here today for this webinar. Again, this is going to get recorded, and then we'll get this uploaded, and once we get into our education platform gets released, you'll have access to all of these webinars. I will tell you that we did this webinar in French earlier in the week. It will be done in Spanish and in Russian next week. And so we encourage you to, have others, and please feel free to share the links with anybody that you think would benefit from this. Our goal is really just to help, provide some resources for those youth that are looking for it. And I know as a coach, I'm constantly looking and researching and reading and trying to find things. And even if I knew before, sometimes it's just great to hear it again and just reminds me of, oh yeah, that's something I need to do. So again, thank you for being here and taking the time to be with us today. I look forward and hope that you'll be a part of our webinars in the future.